What's up guys, Ryan here at Signature Edits, and inside of today's Lightroom tutorial we're taking a look at this week's free RAW files. I'm going to show you how I would edit them, some tips and tricks along the way to improve your compositions, improve your editing, and hopefully improve your photography. You ready? Let's get into it. Alright, so as I said, these photos are all taken for free from signatureedits.com/free raw files. They were uploaded by the awesome photographers in our community, so thanks to them, they're absolutely amazing. And if you want to upload your own to be featured in a tutorial or just online, make sure you do so. Okay, that out of the way, go ahead, download those files, and you can edit with me, or you can simply listen to the soothing sounds of my voice. Alright, so first things first, we're going to talk about the composition of these images and just do a basic review of what could have been done better, how we could have improved these photos in camera. Because I've said it again and again and again, if you can improve your photos in camera, everything about your photography and your editing is going to get easier and better. So make sure when you're taking photos and you finish a shoot and you go back and you're about to start editing, just stop for a second and say to yourself, what could I have done better here? What could have been improved? What should I have done differently that I can apply next time? And when you're actually conscious of that and you take a couple of seconds, couple of minutes to review, you're going to improve your photography so much quicker than if you simply take a bunch of photos, slap a filter on them, and move on to your next shoot. So let's hop over into Photoshop here. We're going to talk about these images, kind of what I love, what maybe could have been improved for next time. Let's talk about image number one here. I love the colors. I love the shadows. I think it's really interesting. We've got a lot of interesting elements going on here. Let's talk about some things that maybe could have been improved. The first thing that stands out to me here is although we've got a lot of really beautiful, interesting things, we don't have a really specific element that's drawing our interest. There's no direction to this photo. There's, this is interesting, this is interesting, this is interesting. There's lots of cool colors, lots of ideas happening here, but nothing that really is clearly the focus of this photo, nothing that is really giving it a cohesive meaning. And when I think of photography and kind of the general way you should approach composition, I like to think of other art forms. So think of music. You've got different instruments doing different things. This is the bass drum, this is the electric guitar, this is the singer. But they're all kind of pointing in the same direction in a good song. They're all uniting around one central idea, whether that's the kind of lyrics of the song or whether that's the kind of musical theme of the song, right? So when we're approaching photography, we want to do the same thing. So we say, okay, what is the main point here? And what I would have loved to do is focus in on one core element and make it bigger and more obvious and more interesting than the rest of the photo so that we have that kind of message that everything is contributing here. It's not just a bunch of random interestingness. So the thing I find the most interesting and fascinating in this particular photo is right here. Now you could approach a lot of different angles. I see there's a cool cardboard cutout. There's some interesting window decor. There's all sorts of things. But I personally would probably have thought about using this door. Now if this composition, instead of making this door just a tiny little element in the frame, if we'd walked over this way just a little bit, and we'd make this door bigger in the frame. So the door maybe started here, and it was that big. It'd be really obvious that the door is the main message of the photo. Everything else would have kind of pointed towards the door. So we've got these nice leading lines, but if we'd gone just a little bit over on the street, we'd be looking up the street and we'd have nice leading lines all pointing towards or away from this door. So that would have really helped unite this composition a little bit. Let's talk about some other things maybe we could have done. These bushes, we've got some nice kind of, let's call this midground, and we've got background. We don't really have any foreground in this image. So another approach might have been to walk over here and make these bushes a lot bigger. If we gotten lower down onto the ground and these bushes kind of took up this much room in the frame, all of a sudden we've got more interest in the shot. Of course, if we had a beautiful model or just somebody walking by right here, knocking on the door, again, we'd add some interest and kind of a sense of purpose to the image. The other nice thing about using framing creatively like this with this bush, it would have covered up what I consider to be the more kind of cluttery elements of the frame. I don't really think that this cardboard sign or all of these really kind of blown out chairs are adding much to the photo. So if we had covered those up, we might have had a better composition. So those are just some things that I might have done a little bit differently. I also would have underexposed a little bit. Dropping this down by a stop would have made sure that these highlights weren't quite so bright. So in camera settings, that's what I might have done. And of course, you could play with depth of field and different stuff like that. But let's move on to our next photo. Okay. This one I love. I love that the photo was taken in the full shade, so we've got really nice highlights because it was a sunny day, but nothing is super blown out here, so we can do some amazing things when it comes to actually editing. What do I find distracting in this image? Well, we've got a really clear, obvious point of interest, which is this bike. I think that the background could be better, mainly if we actually are talking backgrounds, this area right here obviously is blown out because we've got a really bright sunny day in the background. So had we pointed the camera slightly more in this direction, just position the bike differently so that our background was darker than our foreground, that would have really helped with the composition overall. Okay, a couple other things. Well, we've got some weeds down here. We could take care of that in Photoshop, but really just finding a slightly nicer background really would have enhanced this photo a little bit more. Okay, let's talk about other ones. This shot, again, is an example, actually, of the difference a background can make. So this is kind of cluttered. There's no real purpose to the background. Doesn't show much, you know. Whereas this one, oh, we're on a beautiful journey on our motorcycle. What a difference and what a story this tells compared to this one, which is just a shot of a bike somewhere. So you might not have access to this specific background, obviously, but just getting something a little bit more intentional makes a huge difference. The light is obviously beautiful. Things that maybe could have been done differently. Well, you know, there's lots of different things. You could maybe have a rider on the actual bike, but that may or may not be the point of this photo. Maybe underexposing just a little bit more because it looks like we've blown out the sky just a little up here. Would have been nice as far as camera settings go. But overall, I think this is a really beautiful shot, so I probably wouldn't change too much. Okay, here we've got a nice portrait. Let's talk about what's good. You know, the framing's all right. The exposure's pretty good. I'm not loving the light because we've got this dappled light on our subject, which is sort of interesting, but to me it's just not quite enough. It needs to be really dappled if it's going to be dappled. As it is, it kind of just makes her skin look a little bit funky. Obviously, the pose, you could maybe have a softer face is what I would have asked her if I wasn't going for a smile, or just try and get her in the middle of doing something, more of an action shot and less of a, okay, stop swinging and kind of look a little bit angry, and I'll take this photo now. So that's probably what I would have done. Obviously, the actual composition itself doesn't really add a lot of interest. It doesn't tell much of a story. I know she's on a swing, but I can't see any other elements in the background, and the background itself is kind of taking away from the main focus of the picture. So these bushes are kind of cluttery. This thing is cluttery, right? So if we had just maybe positioned ourselves a little bit further back so we could see the whole story, or we had zoomed in a little bit, gone a little bit more shallow, and gotten rid of these distracting background elements, both of those would have helped. Okay, this photo I love because cats are just awesome. I love the shadow, love the use of light. What could be more interesting? Well, I mean, we could talk about different things we could possibly add if there were, I don't know, something that you had in mind to tell more of a story, but at the same time, I think this photo is really beautiful, well exposed. I probably wouldn't change much. Okay, this one, again, really cool concept. I think it just doesn't quite execute. So obviously our main sort of point is the city in the background, and then we've chosen to focus on these branches up here, which I think is interesting and is a cool perspective. However, the branches themselves obviously are not in bloom. So if we had just gotten some other element to focus on so that our background was still out of focus like this, but our foreground was just a little more interesting, I think that would have been nice. Also this tree and this post. So just things like that, being aware if we had slightly angled our camera just like a little bit this way. Now, I don't know what was over here, but a slight angle in this direction, and we could have at least gotten rid of this post, if not this tree, which I think this tree doesn't really add to the shot as it is. Or, another idea, if we had zoomed in here with our lens and instead had this as our in-focus foreground element, and this tree were actually nice and sharp, and the city were still blurry, that would have been a lot more beautiful and interesting to me than these dead branches, which are kind of a little bit cluttered. Okay, again, just opinions, different things. This photo I think is absolutely stunning. Obviously, I think it's amazing, and we've got some nice color. Everything is really working in harmony. It's really supporting the emotion of just kind of wonder and amazement and just loveliness. So I probably wouldn't change that at all. And lastly, we've got a photo taken with a drone. I don't know why it's showing up so HDR, but that would have been a start just to make it a little bit less HDR. Probably would have been helpful. And yeah, we're looking pretty good. I like the composition. Getting a little bit higher up so we could see further down in the skyline probably would have been nice. Because the whole purpose of a drone in my mind is to get that unique perspective. And the higher you get and the more straight down you're shooting, the more interesting it becomes. And as it is, we've got a lot of foreground here that isn't really doing much. It's just empty space. And then our interesting elements are all really small in the screen. So we kind of need something bigger, something to be in the foreground. So maybe even just flying a little bit closer to this bridge, so the bridge were slightly bigger, would take up more of the frame. We'd have less negative space and kind of a clear point of interest that we're aiming for. Okay, so now with that out of the way, let's hop back into Lightroom. Let's edit these together. And you can disagree or you can agree. If you disagree, let me know why in the comments below. If you have different ideas about what could have been done to improve these photos, or you think I'm just a monster, go ahead. Leave that in the comments below. And if this is at all helpful, please do me a favor, hit that like button. Okay, let's talk about actually editing these photos. First things first, I'm going to make my screen as big as possible. That is a tip that I would give you. So normally, if I were editing these and no one was around, I would just use some presets, kind of get things dialed in from there. However, because that's just no fun, we're going to go ahead and get rid of the preset panel today. We'll just talk about what I would do without. So first I'm going to adjust the exposure and the white balance. It's always the first step in your image because that will radically change the results you get. So things are pretty warm, but I don't mind that too much. One quick tip for you with the exposure, you can hit plus and minus on your keyboard, or shift and plus and minus, and adjust that exposure without having to grab the slider. It's going to save you a ton of time, especially when you're editing lots of images. Okay, so let's think about what we actually want to do with this image. I want to bring out this door and make our eye just naturally drawn to it a little bit more. The easiest way to do that is to make it the brightest part of the frame and the biggest part of the frame. So what I'm going to start with is just grabbing a radial filter. We're going to decrease the contrast a little bit, increase the exposure just a little bit, and that's going to brighten that up slightly. Then we can darken everything down, and little by little I'm just going to kind of finagle with this, raise the highlights a little bit, and maybe make it a little bit more texturized. Okay, something around there. Here's before. Hello. Here's after. So we're slightly drawing your eye towards this door a little bit. What else could we do? Well, we could just make it bigger in the frame. So I could zoom in like this. Of course, we're going to lose a lot of the interesting elements in the shot, which is unfortunate. And I don't want to do that too much, but that's an idea. Next, when we're talking about landscape photos overall, it's really about just dodging and burning, which means making certain areas brighter and certain areas darker, adding texture to certain areas and taking away texture from certain areas. And by doing that, you can really just enhance what's already going on in the photo. So just to give you a quick demonstration of that, let's grab just some exposure. And I'm just going to grab the bright parts of the image and make them a little bit brighter. Okay. Nothing super fancy here. And we could actually automate this, and I'll show you that in a second. But I just want you to get an idea of the effect that this can have. So we're kind of just adding contrast to the image, but we're doing it really selectively based on the elements that we want to bring out in the photo, rather than just hitting that contrast slider, bringing it up, and hoping for the best. So I'm only going to do kind of this area in the image. I could go a little bit further down, but if I do that and I start adding it everywhere, then it's not going to be as effective because our eye is going to, again, be drawn everywhere instead of just to this one area. So let's delete this just so you can see before and after. Okay, we've made that pop a little bit. We can lower our exposure now just a little. Here's before, here's after. So we're sort of just sculpting the light a little bit more, just little by little. So now we can do the same thing with our exposure down, only this time what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use a range mask to get the whole thing. So what I'm going to do is paint the entire image just like that with an adjustment brush. Press O to make sure you've done the entire thing. Good. Then I'm going to go down to range mask. I'm going to hit luminance, and I'm going to drag this guy, the range, all the way up to about 90. Now as I do that, you can see that that pink area is changing. I can drag this range from the top to the bottom. And by doing this, I can just select the shadows in the image, just like that. So press O again, and I can actually erase the areas of the image I don't want to kind of enhance the shadows any further. So I'm going to hold Alt, that'll switch to my eraser, and just like that, I'm going to only enhance the shadows on this left part of my image. I just want to add contrast to this area so that our eyes are drawn more to it. So we'll increase the contrast a little bit. Here's before, and here's after. So it's subtle, but it's making a small little change. And many small little improvements are what really are the key to transparent editing that just feels natural, is by doing it little by little, you get the result you're going for. Okay, so I'm not going to fool around with this too much because honestly, there's not a lot of ideas I have here, because the composition I think could be improved a lot more than the actual editing can improve the image. But hopefully you have an idea. That's kind of how I would approach it roughly. I would just repeat that concept. Where do I want to add contrast and add interest, and where do I want to take it away? Okay, let's talk about the next photo. Okay, first off, our white balance needs warming up. Looks really blue to me. Let's go with somewhere around there. And then I just want to make sure we minimize distractions in the photo. Obviously, this is all about our bike. So I'm going to use one of these brush presets I've already made, and it's called, wait for it, when you can't find your own brush, Brooding Dehaze Darken. I'm going to invert that mask using the apostrophe key, and you can see it just kind of adds a dehaze, declarify to the background, or whatever's inside of your mask area. And by doing that, we add a little bit more focus to our bike. Now, you don't need this preset to be able to do this effect. You can just pause the video and make it for yourself and then save this as a preset. Or if you want to grab all of these presets, you can head to shop.signatureedits.com, and they come with every preset pack. So there's your option. So we've done that. Here's before, here's after. Warmed it up, added that declarify, and I'm going to adjust the feather a little bit because it's bleeding onto the bike, and I want the bike to remain nice and sharp. So somewhere around there. Good, much better. That might be a little far. We can play with that. I think it's just a little bit too declarified. It's too obvious. And then I could maybe darken it even more. Good. Another thing you can do is hit this brush icon, and then we can brush in the areas that we want to mask that are not currently being covered. Okay. That is the worst brush I have ever done. So let's just undo that because that is way too obvious. Let's switch our brush flow all the way down, and we're just going to add it a little bit in a couple of these areas. Okay. Wow. Just wow. All right, so our motorcycle is really popping out of the frame now. This might be a little too far. I would probably dial it back just a bit. If you want to adjust all of these settings at once, you can just hit this little triangle and then grab your mount slider, and it should, when Lightroom is behaving itself, adjust all of those sliders at once. Or in this case, it won't do anything, so then you just have to do it manually. It's the worst when you share a tip and it doesn't work. Next, I am just going to enhance the detail in this bike a little bit. We're kind of going to do the same thing. I have an add texture brush. Again, you can pause the video, copy these if you want. I'm going to create another brush, and I'm going to bring out kind of a little bit more brightness inside of our wheel. And we're going to make sure we turn our flow back up, or we're not going to see much at all. So we're going to raise the whites, add a little bit of texture, really just to emphasize that chrome, whatever, the interesting stuff going on. As you can tell, I'm no car expert. We're going to do the same thing with these headlights, just brighten them up a little bit. Headlights feel weird if they're not bright, so here's before and here's after. So already we've kind of brought the bike out from the background, enhanced it a little bit. You might want to dial back some of these effects. They might be a little bit too much for your taste, but go ahead, upload your own version for me. Now the last thing that we could do, obviously there's a million things we could play around with, but I'm thinking if we take some of the saturation out of these greens and yellows, that's really going to make the bike pop a little bit more. So I don't want to do it too much. We can maybe play with the hue instead to see what we're feeling. And then we can lower the luminance of these yellows and greens, and that'll just make that bike pop that much more. If you want to, you could even grab all the saturation out of the image other than kind of the main colors of this bike and get a really interesting effect as well. So that's up to you. Different things you can play with. I'm going to leave it a little bit more natural, somewhere around, say there. Okay, so here's our before and after. I'd keep messing around, but for the sake of this tutorial, I think we better move on. Okay, this image is beautiful. The lighting is really, really nice, and so there's not going to be much to it. I'm going to start by trying to get rid of the distracting element. So there's two options here. I could crop in. If you hold Alt while you're actually adjusting your crop, it will do it in the center instead of off of the corner. Or I could try and use my spot removal tool to get rid of it. But as it is, I think I'm okay with cropping in a little bit. Let's zoom in. Our bike. Oh, we found something that could have been better. Our focus was set incorrectly in camera. It was set to the background instead of the foreground. So we're going to have to add some sharpening to that bike and maybe a little bit of de-clarity, if that is such a word. A little bit of haze to the background just to add some depth and balance things out. So we're going to start with the bike. I love this texture tool. I find it does a great job of getting detail back most of the time. And this time, I'm not absolutely feeling it, so we're just going to go easy on it. Try our sharpness a little bit. I am going to want to dial back on the highlights a little because we're sort of blowing things out a little bit on this bike. Try a little more sharpness. A little dehaze. Okay, so here's before, here's after. So far, I honestly don't know if I've even helped it at all. That's the way it goes. So it's just about trying different things, seeing what works. Even after you've been doing this for a long time, you still don't always know exactly what you're doing, and it's not always perfect. Sometimes you have to mess around for a while. So what I'm doing here, just brightening up the bike. Obviously, our eye is naturally drawn to the brightest part of the image. So by lowering the contrast, raising up the highlights and the exposure a little bit, we're really going to add some obvious brightness to our image and show our eye where it needs to look. So here's before, here's after. Okay, this saddlebag is very, very soft and out of focus, so I'm going to see if I can sharpen just it. And also the rear half of this bike is a little bit dark, kind of lost in shadow. So we're going to attempt to brighten and sharpen all of those. See what we can get away with. Honestly, when it comes to editing photos, if it looks good, it is good. You don't have to worry about doing it exactly the right way, following the perfect strategy. If it visually is working for you, then that's all that really matters, which is awesome. At the same time, certainly some techniques work better than others. Okay, so again, I'm just trying to brighten up this wheel. I'm not being super fussy about my mask because I'm trying to do some pretty gradual adjustments that you're not going to notice if my mask wasn't perfect, but we'll clean it up a little bit. Something like that. So here's before, here's after, just a little bit brighter in the back. Okay, so here's our before, here's our after, kind of bringing out the detail. Now the front of the bike could probably use a little bit of the same treatment down here on the wheel rim and up here by our gas tank and our engine. Good. Okay, lastly, our background we established was perfectly in focus while our foreground was unfortunately a little bit out. So I'm going to grab my brooding dehaze brush again here, and we'll just do a very subtle version. Where are we? Grab that. We're just going to dial everything back. Invert it, so we're adjusting the background. Grab our brush and erase it off the parts of this bike that we don't want to be affected. I shouldn't have to worry about this mask being perfect because we're adding a pretty subtle effect here, so that's why I'm not going to worry too much about it. Okay. And here's our before, here's our after. You could maybe brighten it up a little bit. You could play with some different things. We could add a sun flare. We could maybe warm up the shot a little bit. I'm feeling like that's not too shabby. Let's add a sun flare just to do it. See how it works. So I've got a sun flare brush, of course. Save all of the presets you come up with as brushes because eventually you might find another use for them and it's just going to save you so much time versus making your own. So you can see I can really quickly and easily kind of add some interest to the photo by adding that sun flare just off to the side where the sun is coming from, which is over here. You can tell from the shadow. And basically what this sun flare brush is doing, let me show you that one more time, shoot, is getting rid of all the contrast in that area of the image and just adding some bloom to it. So we're taking our clarity down, dehaze down, saturation down a little bit, sharpness down, and that kind of emulates what a sun flare would feel like before and after. So we just add kind of a golden vibe to our image. And of course, you can enhance that as much as you want. Maybe add a little bit more color to it. Play around till it feels good. I think somewhere around here is fine for our purposes. Maybe extend it a little bit more. And the last thing that I'm going to do is the road itself is a little bit bright. I'm just noticing that now as I zoom out. Sometimes looking at your photo from different perspectives can make a big difference. So I'm going to grab my exposure. I'm going to just take my exposure down a little bit on the road. Why? Because our eyes are naturally drawn to the brighter parts of the image. And the road really isn't contributing much to the shot. So by darkening it, we really just make things feel a lot better. So hopefully that was helpful. Share your own edits. Make sure to tag me at SignatureEditsCo so I can see them on Instagram. All right, this photo here, let's just zoom in for a second. Not super sharp, but it looks like we're not too shabby. So since this is a portrait, I'm going to start, just add some contrast, make sure our exposure and our white balance are about right. Somewhere around there. I'm going to zoom way in, and we're going to address the skin first. We're going to grab our spot removal tool. Bada bing, bada boom, bada bing. And we're just going to get rid of the really obvious blemishes, if there are any. And Lightroom is going to do a mediocre job at identifying how to fix them. But you can dream. Maybe one day Lightroom will figure itself out. Now, one thing is very true when it comes to taking photos of people. The better your light, the more flattering it's going to look on their skin. And having a makeup artist, if it's a planned shoot, makes all the difference in the actual world. Okay, now we could do a million things here. We could deal with, flyaways and various hairs and whatever. I'm just going to show you kind of some quick ideas. First, I'm going to do some skin, let's call it retouching. I'm going to take the contrast down, highlights up, whites up a little bit, texture down a little bit, clarity down a little bit, dehaze down just a little bit. And this is kind of like a nice little airbrush. It's going to smooth out the skin, add a little bit of a glow. And I'm going to put this everywhere we don't need a bunch of detail, where we just want the skin to be a more smooth, more consistent complexion. Okay. Now the next thing that we could do is we could do some contouring. So let's zoom out a little bit. Make sure I get her neck so that it matches. And this hand looks darker than this one, so we might as well just add to that. So here's before that brush and here's after. We really just smoothed out the skin. Maybe that's a little bit too bright. You have to gauge that for yourself. Next, I'm going to do a little bit of contouring. If you don't know what contouring is, that's probably because you're a guy, and that's okay. Essentially, it's what girls do with their makeup to emphasize shadows and highlights in a way that will slim the face, add shape, just strategically make your skin and your face appear to have a nicer structure. So there's two main parts of it. One is adding shadows. Two is adding highlights. It's kind of that simple. So I'm just going to go anywhere that there's already a shadow. As a rule of thumb, you can just add more shadow there, and it will emphasize that shape. So underneath the eyes, underneath the nose, the sides of the nose. So if we want to make her nose appear skinnier, we'd add more of a shadow. Now this is way too extreme, but hopefully you're understanding the concept here. We'd add more of a shadow, and then her nose will appear smaller. If we do the opposite, and we brighten, can you brighten the shadow? And we illuminate the shadowed area a little bit, it will make her nose appear less pronounced and wider. So that's what you can do with contouring. I'm just going to keep going through here just a little bit. So adding a little bit of shadow strategically, so we could go underneath the cheekbones here. Something like that. We could go underneath her chin. She already has a very pronounced chin happening, so that's okay. Good. And then we'll add some highlights, do the exact same thing. So add a little bit of highlight there on the center of the nose, on the top of the cheekbone. Basically, shadow and highlight tend to be right next to each other. So anywhere that you added a shadow, right above it tends to be a highlight. Or beneath it, I guess. Okay, so let's just show you. Here's before and here's after. Now, I'm not saying this is the best retouching job in the world. It's just some basic concepts when you're actually doing these kind of edits that can really help and make a difference. So without having to spend 3 hours in Photoshop, this is kind of the approach I take. If it's just a basic, I don't need to spend all of my time on it, that's where I'm going to go with that. I have a texture brush here that I'm just using to add texture now to her eyes and her eyebrows. And again, with her lips, we'll do the same thing. And lastly, we could do it with her hair. And we're just enhancing the contrast, bringing out detail where we want detail, and hiding detail where we want to smooth things out. Okay, so let's just show you before and after. Hello. So we've really just improved the skin tones, enhanced things, brought her eyes out a little bit, her lips out a little bit, added some contouring, and hopefully you can see the difference there. Now, lastly, there's a million things you could do with this photo. I'm just going to leave it with some basic. We're going to lower the exposure around her, as your eyes are naturally drawn to the brightest parts of the photo. And we're going to lower the texture and the clarity just a little bit. So that will add a little bit more kind of depth separation from the background. So here's before that and after that. Subtle change, but overall you add all those up and you get a big difference. Okay, moving on to my favorite photo. We should give this cat a name. Leave a comment below with your vote for this cat's name. For now, I will call him, Sir Crumpleton. Seems like a good cat name to me. What do you think? Which names are better for pets? Names that are just way too ridiculous to be a pet name, like Harry, or names that are just way too ridiculous to be a person's name, like Sir Crumpleton? Okay, let's talk about actual edits here instead of me just getting distracted. First off, I love this photo. I don't think it needs much, and it's going to totally depend on what you personally want to do and bring to the table here. I'm going to start by just adding texture, emphasizing the things I love, and then playing with the light and the shadow. So the whiskers, the eyes, really want to make those bright and obvious. Again, if you want these settings, just save them, pause the video, make your own brush preset. If you're using Lightroom CC, you won't have brush presets, and that's just sad, but you can always head over to Lightroom Classic, which has way more features, and I personally recommend. Okay, so we've added some texture. Let's just do a really basic reset everything, and we'll just enhance our shadows. So anywhere we've got a dark spot we want to bring out, we're just going to do some contouring on our cat. Exact same kind of process, only with a cat you can get away with a lot more, because with a person you know exactly what things are supposed to look like, and if you play with them too much they tend to look weird. When you've got a cat face, well, you can be a little more creative. So here's before that and after. So we've just kind of added some contrast, added some interest and some depth. We're going to do the same thing quickly here with our highlights. So anywhere bright that I want to enhance. Probably not the ear, that doesn't need more attention, but around the eyes, the tip of the nose, these little cat cheeky things. Cat cheeky things, is that a thing? And then even the areas of like the edges of the cat against the background, I'm just going to enhance those a little bit so it stands out just a little bit more. And again, we could go in here with all of this fluff and the bright spots. We could just make a little bit brighter. You can get as carried away as you want to with this. And the dark spots we'll make a little bit darker. So we'll switch back to our darkening brush, which I think was this one. Hello Lightroom, please unfreeze. And you can see that was way too obvious, but you can just darken down certain areas. That's going to add a little bit more texture and shape overall to our image. Okay, here's before, here's after. So you can see that's made a pretty big difference. Did I go too far? Yes, probably, so I'd go back and I would adjust it more, but for the sake of this tutorial, we're just going to call that a day. Maybe I'm just going to brighten his nose because Sir Crumpleton, he demands the best. Okay, that was just way too much. Take what you think is good, dial it back by 20%, and that is the best advice I can give you. Okay, now lastly, there is a kind of distracting element, which is this kind of confetti table down here. So we could crop that out, or because everything else is shadow, I might be able to just use our spot removal tool and literally just get rid of it. We'll see what happens here. Put our opacity all the way up. There you go, Lightroom magic. Okay, so that is that. This photo right here, we're going to start with just adding some exposure, a little bit of contrast. Now, how much exposure do you add? Well, you can go by the histogram and try and get things balanced, make sure you don't have anything clipping on either side, or you can just say, okay, what does this photo look like it needs? And for me, that's somewhere around here. So that feels good. Now, again, I personally think this photo, our composition could be improved. So I go back here, maybe change some things slightly, take the image in a different time of season. We've got some leaves here. I'm not exactly sure, but I'm not super inspired by this. And so when you're not inspired by the actual photo, it becomes hard to say, okay, I should do this, because you just sort of run out of ideas. We're going to add a basic S-curve here. That's just adding some contrast to the image, just to make things pop a little bit. And then you say, okay, what elements can we emphasize and what distractions can we get rid of? Well, we've got a weird post here in the corner, so we could get rid of that. And I sort of feel like these branches work, but it's because we have so many branches on the left here, it's a little bit more cluttered than it could be. So let's just see what happens if we zoom in a little bit more. At this point, we're probably losing too much resolution, but let's just say, see, here's before, after, before, after. We've kind of added some focus to the image. Maybe you like that, maybe you don't. I'm not going to spend too much time on this photo today. We've already talked about it. Okay, this one I just love. It's beautiful. Absolutely awesome. So let's just raise the exposure, see what's in our foreground, if there's any elements we really want to bring out. And I mean, it's interesting, but I think that I honestly kind of like it more bathed in shadow. So there's a few options. We could leave it flat like this, or we could try and just bring out some color. I'm thinking the dehaze is going to be great here. Pull that up a little bit. Good. Let's hide this. Get a little more screen real estate. And now I want to just see what I want to bring out in the image and what I want to kind of minimize. So I'm going to start by trying to bring these clouds out a little bit more against the background. How am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to add some texture. So I could go through, adjust all these one at a time. I'm just going to use the brush to save some time. And I'm going to paint on these couple of clouds here. All right, just enhancing what is already in the photo. Next, let's maybe follow this mountain line. And I'm not loving it. So we'll undo that. Keep that mountain dreamy. Next, we're going to try just adding some exposure in this shadow area down here. See how we like that. Okay, not too bad. Don't love it, don't hate it. I'm going to try doing the same thing, but with a graduated filter. So it'll be the most strong at the very bottom and sort of taper off naturally for me. It'll help make a more natural mask. Kind of like that. Do I love it? I'm not sure. Leave a note in the comments below. I am going to go ahead and at the same time increase the clarity a little bit and the texture just a little bit. Not that much. And then dial back everything. So we've just gone from pure black to just bringing that out a little. Honestly, as I'm looking at it, I'm thinking clarity and texture was the wrong direction. It's actually better when it's more dreamy. But I kind of like having the foreground there rather than just blackness. Lastly, I could add some color to the sky. So one awesome tip that I got from a video I can't remember way back when, instead of actually trying to add color to the sky, you can just adjust the white balance and it'll make a big difference. So if we take our white balance, shift it towards blue, we're going to add a whole bunch of blue. Shift it towards yellow, can add a whole bunch of yellow. So we can shift it towards blue very slightly, and that will enhance the blue of our sky. That's an option. Of course, you can do all sorts of other things. We can totally change the colors. We can adjust the hue up here. Now let's head over to our orange band in the middle of this photo. And this is the one that really is going to be awesome if we can make it pop. So let's grab our orange and intensify it a little bit. Shift it towards magenta maybe. Just sort of playing around. Add some contrast. So here's before, here's after, just subtly adding a little bit. Play with our hue to warm things up. And I'm not loving how unsubtle this particular effect is. It's really not blending super nicely. If I press O, I can see it's because my mask is just nonsense. So one option here, if you click once in Lightroom with this brush and then hold shift and click again, it'll actually make a perfectly straight line connecting these 2 points. So with a sky, that's going to be a much more effective line than if I just tried to draw it and it wasn't quite perfectly straight. So you can just line it up the way that it should be. Let's go here to say here. You can see we've improved that mask a little bit. Okay, looking all right. My screen here is in the direct sun and I'm having trouble seeing, so if there's stuff I'm missing, apologies there. That's kind of what's going on. Let's zoom in a little bit, see what's going down if we check out the rest of the image. Come on, take me down here. Please, please. Okay, for some reason Lightroom is being as stupid. I think that these mountains, if we could bring out the detail a little bit, would be kind of cool. So let's just see what we're working with. Yeah, there's still a little bit of detail hidden inside of there, so we'll undo that. Add a little bit of texture here because the mountains are the most interesting part of this photo. Raise the whites a little bit. And hopefully that'll help make that image pop just a little bit more. And of course, my mask is really messy. It's covering this guy, so we could try erasing with our auto mask. Hello. Make sure you're actually using the eraser. And sometimes it'll work. And sometimes you forget to put the auto mask on. So let's try that again now that we've erased that. We'll just brush in here, and this time we've actually followed the mountains quite nicely. Here's before, here's after. So there's a million different directions you could go with this. You could continue playing with your HSL. You could get all sorts of extreme colors. Darken down our blues here, that'll enhance things even further. Do the same thing with our oranges, just, you know, there's a million different things. You're never going to run out of ideas in Lightroom. The key is just saying, okay, what am I actually going for here? And knowing when to walk away and when you're just making a mess. Because trust me, there's many times I've thought I've really improved the photo. I come back 10 minutes later and all of a sudden it's 10 times worse than it was. Okay, here's our original shot instead of the one DJI decided to give us. Let's zoom in a little bit. All right, let's talk about different things. First, I'm going to see if I can recover much detail. Looks like not too bad. I didn't blow too much out, so we're just going to get a decent exposure, which for me is somewhere around there. I'm going to start with trying to get some color back in the sky. I'm going to do it with an auto mask and just see what happens here. Okay, that was absolutely terrible. So instead of auto masking, we're going to range mask. So I'll paint across everything. Down here to the range mask, go to luminance, set that to just the highest part. Range, like anything above 83 to 100. You can see that allows us just to darken our sky right down. So we'll darken it, darken it, darken it. And I'm going to add some blue to the sky, maybe. A little bit of saturation, just see what's happening. Okay, that's feeling better. Now we're just going to brighten the areas of interest and darken other areas and just sort of enhance this photo little by little. So we're going to start with our buildings here. The world's sloppiest brush technique. Go across our bridges. And again, we're just enhancing because your eye naturally goes to the brightest parts of the image, so you can see things pop. I'm not saying this is good. We're going to fix it, dial it back in a second here. But you're going to see that your eye just knows where to look a little bit more once we enhance the contrast in this photo. So here's before this nonsense brush, and here's after. Now if we dial this back so it's not so ridiculous, we actually add some contrast. And we brighten things up. And then we erase the parts of this photo that are not working. Here's before, here's after. Add a little texture maybe. Maybe a little dehaze. and just see what we can get away with without being too picky about our brush. Erase this and do a second pass. Same kind of thing. So again, where do we want to enhance? Where do we want to take away? I think these buildings still need to be a little brighter, particularly over there. Good. Now we're going to do the same thing. Where do we want to darken things down? So I'm going to grab the shadow areas of the image. You're just playing with the light, sculpting it. So this building, for example, we've got a really bright part up here, and then we've got some darker shadows. I'm just going to attempt very roughly and quickly to bring those out a little bit more. Dark parts, make darker. Light parts, make lighter. Pretty simple, right? Good. Okay. Nowhere near done. Needs a lot of work. I'm going to get rid of this building here that's blown out. Here's before. Here's after. So at least that's a little bit better. Here's the reset version, and here's after. So we could keep going forever. I think probably the main point of interest in this photo is the bridge. So I would definitely spend some more time just brightening this bridge, making it pop in the photo. Easiest way to do that, raise the whites, raise the highlights. Something like that. Do the same on the reflection. You can see as we slowly do this, we're adding some direction to our photo, adding some purpose, adding some intention. And then lastly, I think this definitely needs a different crop. If we go with, say, 16:9, I think that's just going to be a lot more interesting overall than all of this empty negative space that's not really adding to our image. So that is how I would approach that. Maybe a little more contrast, a little more brightness, dial those highlights back. You can see it's a never-ending story. Things are never perfect. So if this photo wasn't perfect for you, well, that's okay. Give yourself grace. I certainly give myself lots because I need it. Hopefully this was helpful in some way, shape, or form. That's kind of covers it for this week's free raw files. If you want to download them, practice along with me, feel free to rewind or just go ahead, practice by yourself. I hope you create something awesome this weekend. And again, if this was helpful for you, do me a favor, hit that like button, make sure to subscribe, and I'll leave a link to some free presets below if you want to check those out. All right, see you in the next video. Peace.